Kody just exposed himself, and what he said about marriage and Robyn changes everything, so stay with me and subscribe because you need to hear this. What if the biggest problem with Kody Brown is not what he says on Sister Wives, but what he says when he thinks he is simply giving advice to a fan? Because some of his recent cameo messages have created a very different picture of the man viewers have watched for years, and one particular message about marriage has people looking twice at everything. Kody has said about relationships, family, and responsibility for years during the Sister Wives Tell All. Kody talked about the breakdown of his marriages and suggested that he was not the only person responsible for those relationships failing. And on the surface, that may sound like a reasonable statement because relationships involve more than one person, but the way the conversation unfolded raised a much bigger question about accountability, because when a family falls apart, every person may have their own perspective, yet viewers are still left wondering who is willing to honestly examine their own choices, and that question becomes even more interesting when we look at the advice Kody has given through Cameo, where fans pay him to record personal messages and sometimes ask him to share advice about birthdays, marriages, honeymoons, or major life moments, instead of keeping the focus entirely on the people who requested the message. Kody has sometimes turned those conversations into stories about his own experiences, and one honeymoon story in particular has attracted attention because rather than simply congratulating a newly married couple and encouraging them to communicate, respect each other, and enjoy their new chapter, Kody began describing his own honeymoon with Robyn and talking about how they spent their time together. He explained that they were not traveling with a huge amount of money and described having limited spending resources, while also talking about food, travel, and their time together. And then the message shifted toward the idea that a honeymoon should be about discovering one another, connecting deeply, and making time for the relationship on its own. That advice is actually fairly harmless and could even be considered useful. But the reason viewers reacted so strongly is because Kody repeatedly brought his own relationship with Robyn into a message that was supposed to be about another couple. That creates an uncomfortable question about boundaries and why someone giving marriage advice would need to make their own romantic experience such a major part of the conversation. For years, Sister Wives avoided publicly discussing intimate details between the adults because the family understood that certain parts of marriage belonged behind closed doors. And even during difficult seasons, the wives often tried to protect those boundaries. That makes Kody speaking so openly about his honeymoon especially noticeable because it changes the tone of the conversation and gives viewers another reason to examine how he talks about relationships. The bigger issue is not simply what happened during that honeymoon, because nobody outside that marriage can know every private detail, and speculation cannot replace facts. The bigger issue is what Kody seems to believe a successful relationship should look like, and how those beliefs connect to the problems viewers have watched unfold inside his family. Kody has also spoken about how every person in his life can bring something different to a relationship, and that idea can sound reasonable because every relationship does involve different personalities, needs, experiences, and forms of support. But viewers have questioned whether Kody sometimes describes relationships in a way that sounds more transactional than mutual. That question becomes especially important when considering his past comments about his marriages. Because a healthy relationship is not simply about what one person receives from another. It is supposed to involve communication, respect, responsibility, compromise, and emotional connection from both sides. And that brings us to another part of Kody's recent comments that may be even more revealing than the honeymoon story, because he has also talked about mothers, fathers, and the different ways parents connect with their children. Kody has suggested that mothers may have a special biological bond with their children, and he has connected that idea to hormones released around childbirth. There is a real biological basis for bonding hormones such as oxytocin, but the leap from biological bonding to the idea that mothers naturally provide unconditional love while fathers must be the stricter parent is far more complicated. Fathers can be deeply loving, nurturing, patient, and emotionally available, and mothers can also struggle with parenting or emotional connection. Parenting is not a simple division between one parent who loves and another parent who disciplines. The strongest families usually need both affection and boundaries from both parents. So when Kody talks about being the tough parent and describes mothers as naturally more emotionally connected, viewers may reasonably ask what that philosophy means for the way he approaches his own children. And this is where the story becomes much bigger than one cameo, because the real question is whether the things Kody says about marriage Parenting and responsibility match what viewers have watched throughout Sister Wives. If they do not match, then what explains the difference? Is it simply a matter of editing and television pressure, or are viewers finally hearing more of Kody's personal philosophy because Cameo gives him a different platform? That question is what keeps this story from being just another strange celebrity message, because when someone spends years appearing on reality television, the audience naturally compares their public statements with their behavior and relationships over time. Kody may believe he is simply sharing personal wisdom, but every statement can also reveal how he thinks about marriage, family, and fatherhood. And that is where the story takes a much more unexpected turn, because the honeymoon comments are only one piece of a much larger conversation about how Kody sees the people closest to him. And if you think the honeymoon story was the most surprising part, wait until you look at the way he talks about unconditional love and what those comments could mean for the future of his family, because that is where the conversation becomes much harder to ignore. Kody has talked about the idea that every relationship provides something different, and that people can fulfill different emotional roles in our lives, and there is nothing unusual about acknowledging that different people bring different qualities into a family. But the concern comes when relationships are described primarily through what another person provides rather than through what both people build together. In a plural family, that distinction becomes even more important, because every marriage requires trust, communication, and fairness, and when one relationship appears to receive more attention than the others, viewers naturally begin asking whether the family structure itself was ever balanced. That does not prove wrongdoing, and it does not tell us what happened privately, but it does explain why certain comments attract so much attention. The same pattern appears when Kody talks about parenting, because saying that fathers have to be the tough ones may sound traditional, but it can also create an unhealthy assumption that emotional closeness belongs mostly to mothers, while fathers are expected to remain distant disciplinarians. Children need more than correction, they need encouragement, attention, patience, affection, guidance, and the feeling that they can communicate with a parent even when they disagree. As the Sister Wives family has changed over the years, viewers have seen adult children establish their own boundaries and relationships with their parents, and those developments have made Kody's comments about parenting particularly significant. Nobody watching from the outside can know every private conversation inside the Brown family, and it would be unfair to claim that one cameo explains every family conflict, but Kody's own words do give viewers something real to examine, because unlike rumors or online speculation, these are statements attributed to Kody himself. The important question is not whether every controversial sentence makes him a terrible husband or father. The important question is whether his philosophy encourages the kind of communication and accountability that relationships actually need. If Kody believes every failed marriage is equally the responsibility of everyone involved, then the natural follow-up question is whether he has clearly acknowledged his own role in those failures. If he believes fathers must be the strict ones, then the next question is whether he also recognizes the importance of showing emotional support. And if he believes every person brings something different into a relationship, then viewers can reasonably ask whether every person in his family was actually treated as equally important. Those questions do not require insults or personal attacks, they simply require looking at the pattern, and perhaps that is why these cameo clips have become so interesting, because they give viewers another window into Kody's thinking outside the carefully produced world of Sister Wives. A reality show can contain editing, storylines, interviews, and selective moments, but a personal message recorded for a paying fan can sometimes sound much more spontaneous. That does not automatically make every statement more truthful, but it can make the audience pay closer attention. Kody may have intended to offer encouragement to a newly married couple, yet the message ended up bringing his own marriage philosophy into the spotlight. His comments about his honeymoon, his ideas about emotional connection, his thoughts about mothers and fathers, and his views about responsibility all combine into one larger picture that viewers are now trying to understand. And there is one final question that may matter more than all the others. If Kody genuinely believes relationships require accountability from everyone involved, then what does accountability look like for him personally? Because the Brown family story has changed dramatically over the years, and marriages have ended, children have grown up, and former partners have moved forward with their own lives. At this stage, the audience is not simply watching a family argue about the past, they are watching people decide what kind of relationships they want in the future. Kody can explain his perspective, and former family members can explain theirs, but ultimately viewers have to decide which actions and statements appear consistent over time. Maybe that is the real lesson hidden inside this strange cameo story. The most revealing part may not be the honeymoon at all, it may be the philosophy behind the words, because when someone talks about marriage, parenting, love, and accountability, they're also telling the audience what they believe those things are supposed to look like. And once viewers start comparing those beliefs with everything they have watched on Sister Wives, the conversation becomes much bigger than one awkward message. It becomes a question about whether the man giving relationship advice has learned from the relationships he says he understands. And that is exactly why this story is not ending with the cameo, because every new statement creates another question, and every question sends viewers back to the moments they thought they already understood. So perhaps the biggest surprise is still ahead. Because if Kody continues speaking publicly about marriage, family, and parenting, viewers may get an even clearer picture of what he believes went wrong, and whether he sees himself as part of the solution or simply another person affected by the collapse of the family. And that distinction could change the way people interpret everything that comes next. But here is where the story becomes even more interesting, because once you step away from the individual comments and look at the bigger picture, another question starts to appear, and that question is whether Kody actually understands why his relationships changed so dramatically, or whether he has created a version of the story where everyone shares the blame equally and nobody has to look too closely at his own decisions. For years, viewers watched Kody describe his family as one united household, even when the marriages were clearly becoming more complicated, and the emotional distance between him and some of his wives was becoming impossible to ignore. At different points, Kody talked about loyalty, respect, attraction, communication, and obedience. And every time another marriage reached a breaking point, the audience was left trying to understand what had actually changed. Now, when Kody says that relationships take two people and that both people can contribute to the failure of a marriage, the statement sounds simple. But the real question is what comes after that sentence. Does accountability mean admitting where you were wrong? Or does it simply mean saying everyone is responsible and moving on? Those are two completely different things. And this is why his recent comments have attracted so much attention, because people are not only listening to the words, they are comparing those words with years of footage and interviews. If Kody believes every failed relationship is a shared responsibility, then viewers may reasonably expect him to identify his own mistakes just as clearly as he identifies the mistakes of other people. Without that part, accountability can sound more like explanation than reflection, and the same issue appears when he discusses his relationship with Robyn, because he often describes their connection as something deeply special and different from what came before. There is nothing wrong with being happy in a marriage, but when one relationship is repeatedly presented as the strongest while other relationships are discussed in terms of conflict, disappointment, or failure, it naturally raises questions about whether the family structure ever allowed those other marriages to receive the same emotional investment. Again, this does not prove what happened behind closed doors, and nobody watching television can know the private reality of another person's marriage, but viewers are allowed to notice patterns in what the family members themselves have publicly said. That is especially true when former wives have described their experiences differently from Kody. One person can remember a relationship one way while another remembers the same years completely differently, and reality television makes that problem even more complicated because cameras only capture selected moments. But when the same themes continue appearing over multiple seasons, audiences naturally start asking whether there is something deeper underneath them. And perhaps the most revealing theme is not romance at all, it is control. Kody has repeatedly talked about respect and loyalty, and those words can mean very different things depending on what each person believes a marriage should look like. In any relationship, respect should involve listening to another person's perspective even when it is uncomfortable. Loyalty should not require someone to erase their own identity or remain silent about problems. A healthy marriage needs room for disagreement, because two adults are never going to think exactly alike. This is especially important in a family. At the end, Kody's own words raise the biggest questions about love, marriage, and accountability. So if you want the next Sister Wives update, subscribe now, because this story is far from over.